This week, I'm revisiting a form you may have already seen me throw and trim in a previous video. This time though, I'll be showing you how I make it from beginning to end, from a thrown lump like this to the finished piece that's reduction fired in my gas kiln. The idea with this project was to create a series of bowls that are raised on tall, elegant feet. Each one is thrown the same, with a thin bowl section at the top and with a thicker mass of clay beneath it, from which I could trim numerous styles of foot. Once the lump of clay has been fully centered, a process which I discussed in exacting detail in my previous week's video, which I'll leave a link to on screen now and in the description below. Once centered, I make a hollow that goes about halfway down the lump, which purposefully means the bottom section is solid. I then simply continue to throw the top part into the bowl form I'm after, until the rim of it meets my throwing gauge's pointer, which you can see jutting in from the right. That point that's set in space gives me a target to aim for as I'm throwing, and as it measures both the height and the diameter, it ensures that my thrown pots are more or less identical. I pinch the clay around the halfway point and gradually pull the walls up. Once the height of the vessel is more or less there, I'll do a few more pulls just to make sure the shape is correct. And now I have the rough form, I can go through the finishing procedure, which is more or less the same for all the pots I throw on the wheel. I begin by sponging up the excess water from inside the pot, and then I use a curved rubber kidney which is inserted into the form, and I press it against the interior shape. This cleans up the walls and smooths them. I then do the same to the outside to define the shape and to remove as much of that slip as possible. As I do this, I'm really pushing from the inside out, easing the clay out gently against the metal. As for the bottom foot section, I just scrape away the outermost layer of clay. As this section's so thick, if I left it covered in slip, it may take even longer to dry than it's going to already. And ideally when trimming these, I want the bowl section and the foot section to be at a similar level in terms of consistency, and it's why the slow drying of these to get to that point is really important, as it's when pots dry out unevenly that things start to crack and warp. A few days later, after these have been drying both in the open air and beneath plastic, the bowls are ready to turn. The solid foot sections feel very leather hard, but I'm sure on the inside, once I start to trim these, I'll reveal clay that's a bit softer. I use a variety of tools when trimming. Generally, if I want to remove a lot of clay very quickly from the outside of the forms, I'll use tungsten carbide tools. But for removing clay on the inside, I'll be using quite cheap and generic looped turning tools. I begin by tap centering the bowl into place and then firmly securing it with 3 lumps of soft clay that are pushed around the base near the rim, after which the pot is trimmed into whatever shape I want it to be. And as I wanted each one to be different, this made the task really quite enjoyable, as I wasn't so focused on making them all identical. For instance, this one, I wanted it to look as if the bowl was being supported by a miniature version of itself, and I think ultimately this one would end up being my favourite. For these pots, trimming the exterior form was the easy part. The more difficult part was hollowing out the foot ring, as the turnings constantly fill up the hole I'm trying to create, which means I have to stop and start constantly in order to excavate the hole so I can continue trimming, but perhaps more importantly, so I can see what I'm doing. Before I begin to hollow out the inside form, I trim the top surface so it's nice and flat, and then I slowly begin to trim down, removing the clay layer by layer. Now, there is another approach to doing this. Instead of trimming the foot from a solid block of clay like this, you could instead throw a series of bowls which have no foot rings, which would be trimmed with a curved base, onto which you attach some soft clay and you throw the foot ring from that. It would work equally well, perhaps, and it certainly means you don't need to spend as much time doing this fiddly trimming, although it does mean you need to spend more time waiting for the different parts to dry out, first for the thrown bowl itself, and then for the thrown foot, and then finally it can be trimmed. Whereas with the method I use, I just have to throw them once and wait for them to dry out once, so there's a bit less back and forth, and there's also much less of a chance that a crack will develop between the two attached pieces. Lastly, I use the flat of my nail just to burnish the sharper parts on the bottom of the pot, and then I stamp these with my maker's mark right down in the bottom of the foot. And that's more or less it for one of these. I won't show you how I trimmed all of them, but you'll get a good idea of the other shapes as the video progresses. Ultimately, I wanted to have a group where each one would have a different foot to either be displayed in a line and ultimately used, of course. I will show you a time lapse of another foot being trimmed though, just to give you a good idea about how much clay is removed during this process. After all of the pots were trimmed, I left them out for a couple of days up high in the studio so they could dry out, and once they were totally bone dry, which means there's no more moisture left in them, they can be packed into the electric kiln for a bisque firing to 1000 degrees centigrade. For these firings I pack in as many pots as I physically can, and it doesn't matter if they touch at this point, as the clay itself won't get hot enough to fuse together. So I stack pots, pile them up together, and really squeeze them in side by side, so as much of the available space is used. Packing this kiln is a relatively quick process. It has an internal capacity of 200 litres, and the only thing I need to be really careful about is how I handle the pots. They are incredibly fragile at this point, and all it takes is for one small knock to chip them, or even just squeezing a pot too much is enough to cause it to crack. So how they're held and placed into the kiln really matters, especially when the pots are very thinly trimmed and they have a lot of delicate edges. After one layer is filled up, I position 3 more props and do another, all the way until the kiln is filled up to the brim. Once the kiln's fully loaded, I quickly check to make sure nothing's protruding over the top, and then it's sealed. I then make sure my firing program is set correctly, and then I switch it on to fire overnight. About 48 hours later, it's time to unpack the bisque firing. The pots at this stage are now much harder, although they are still fragile. They've also become quite porous, and they suck up water like a sponge, which is a necessary quality needed for the next step in the process, which is glazing. Although sadly I did forget to film one section, which was the waxing of these tall-footed bowls, which is something I do immediately after they've been unpacked from the electric kiln. And all this is the process of brushing on some wax emulsion onto the base of the pot, which essentially acts just like a wax resist and prevents glaze from adhering onto the bases of pots. If, during the final firing, I left glaze coating the bottom of my vessels, they'd solidly fuse to the kiln shelf as the glaze fluxes and welds to it, and thus the pot is destroyed, but there's also a high chance that the kiln shelf itself will be damaged. Once all the pots have been unpacked, I wheel the kiln back into the corner of the room just so it takes up less space in the workshop. To the left of this electric kiln, you can see my air compressor, which is an unfortunate necessity for the gas kiln. There's an air outlet by each of the 4 burners, and it helps give the flames a bit more pressure so they can flow around the kiln properly. And I say unfortunate, simply because it is very loud. The next step for these bowls is to glaze them. This is a 2% red iron oxide based crackle glaze that's formulated for reduction firing. Simply put though, it's a variety of raw materials such as feldspar, whiting, nepheline cyanide, and of course red iron oxide, which is all slaked down in water, sieved, and then ready to use. The water helps to transfer the raw materials onto the outside of the vessel, because as the water is absorbed into the porous clay body, it leaves a layer of these mixed raw materials on the outside of the pot. I clasp each bowl with a pair of tongs, and then I submerge it beneath the glaze and hold it there for about 4 to 5 seconds. It's then removed, and I allow the excess glaze to flow off. And if you look at the foot as it's removed, you can clearly see the area which has had the wax painted over it, which hopefully saves me a lot of tidying up work later on, which is the next step for these, which is usually done a few days later once both the glaze and the clay body have fully dried out. As when this happens, the glaze goes from being quite tacky and difficult to tidy to very powdery, which is much easier to clean up, simply with the use of a finger which I can rub over the surface of the glaze, to fill in the tongue marks and to scrape clean any other stray drips or messy glaze. As I was glazing work and firing the kiln in tandem, I often place freshly glazed pieces beneath the kiln so they can dry out really quickly. Otherwise I place them on the shelves above the radiators or just high up in the studio where the air's warmer. The next task is to fettle clean the surfaces of these, which, on the whole, is quite a slow and arduous task. I always work above a basin of water. That way, the excess glaze that's removed as I make the surface very even and smooth falls into the water, and eventually I can recycle this back into my larger buckets of glaze, so very little of it is actually wasted. To scrape away more prominent drips, I switch to a blunt paring knife, which I use to slice them away and then go over those surfaces with my fingertip, which sort of acts like sandpaper. Lastly, I use a water-soaked sponge just to clean over the waxed surface. Some droplets of glaze do settle onto it, and if I didn't remove them, there would be little blobs of glaze left on the bare clay once they've been fired. Making sure the glaze is clean and tidy at this stage really makes a big impact once they're fired. But this process is time consuming. All this care and attention to detail adds hours and hours onto the process of finishing pots. It's highly repetitive too, as compared to say the raw glazing I did during my apprenticeship at Maze Hill Pottery with Lisa Hammond. Raw glazing is quite seamless and quick, and after the slips had been coated on, there was no need to tidy them up afterwards. It's effortless in comparison, although there is a high learning curve that comes with it, as it means the pots are glazed when they're leather hard, and if they're made too thinly, or if too much slip is applied, the pots can just collapse, which ultimately means you have to create pots which can withstand taking on such thick layers of slip, and I don't think the thin pots I make nowadays would be able to do so. As it stands, I tend to dedicate a couple of weeks just to glazing, as I never just work on a handful of pots at a time. Instead, there are hundreds of pieces, all being glazed and cleaned up, just like this bowl. And once these hundreds of pots are finally clean and ready for the kiln, I can begin to load it up. My gas kiln is a Rohde HMT500, which has an internal capacity of 340 litres, which is 12 cubic feet, and I can squeeze about 150 to 170 pots in, depending on the size of course. Whilst for their bisque firing I could pack the pots so they touched one another, for a glaze firing like this they absolutely can't touch, otherwise the glazes from each of them will fuse together and the pots will usually be ruined, so as they go in they're positioned with about 2 to 3 millimeters between them. And it's a relatively quick process loading this kiln. I just have to be careful not to knock the pots together, otherwise the glazes can chip. The kiln itself is fueled with natural gas, and once lit it takes about 9 hours to fire, which is usually a process I begin early the following morning. I ignite each of the 4 burners, with the door open initially, which is a safety precaution more than anything. I'll then swing close the door and seal it tight. During the early stages, I just gradually increase the temperature. When the pyrometer reads 860 degrees Celsius, it's time to initiate reduction. I do this by dramatically increasing both the gas pressure and the air pressure. I also close the dampers, which cover the flues of the kiln, to about halfway. This puts the kiln into a reduced state, which means the internal atmosphere is burning with insufficient oxygen, and as the gas inside combusts, it does so inefficiently and seeks more oxygen, which it ends up finding from within the clay and glazes of the pots themselves, and thus changes their colour. After I've initiated this atmosphere, the temperature begins to climb a bit more slowly, and as it increases, the flames that protrude from the kiln become brighter and stronger. For each firing I keep meticulous notes, just so I have a record over time of the firings I've done, and if I do have a particularly good firing, I should be able to see what I've done differently in the notes, although how the pots are packed inside can make a huge difference too. I don't only fire the kiln by what the pyrometer tells me. Through these spy holes in the door, I can see pyrometric cones. These are 3 little coloured prongs which I place inside, and they gradually melt and bend over as the heat work affects them, which is heat over time. Clay and glazes need time to mature during the firing, and if instead I fired them very quickly up to the top temperature, not only might the pots explode, but they might simply just not look how I intended. Once the pyrometric cones have bent over sufficiently, it's time to end the firing. I always start by switching off the mains valve, and then each individual burner, and I always welcome the sound of silence that comes after firing for 9 hours straight. There is one last thing I do, which is open the dampers and the spy holes to quickly let the kiln cool from 1290 degrees to 1000 degrees Celsius, a process called crash cooling, which supposedly helps retain colour and gloss. A few days later, once the kiln has fully cooled down, it's time to crack it open, a moment that's always riveting and both feverishly exciting and nerve-wracking. As this entire final process has happened behind closed doors, of course I know roughly what's happening, but there's no way of looking inside at the pots properly as they're firing, and you only really know what you're going to get when the door's opened. This does provide potters with a clear finishing line though, as after the pots have been glazed and fired, there's very little more you can do to them. You can't keep working and working, chiselling and carving away, or painting with no idea when the piece is finished. Once they've been fired in a kiln, the pots are set in stone, and that's it. For a short while at least the pots remain too hot to touch, so I simply look and I shine a torch inside so I can see what's happening in the shadowy depths. And once I can touch the pots without them scolding me, they can all be taken out. And after seeing them all laid out, like so, you'll gain a better understanding of what happened inside. There's always a few pots that didn't work. Some will be thirds and might need to be smashed immediately due to their defects, and others could be seconds, pieces that could be savable with another firing, or they go into one of my seconds boxes, which will one day be sold at an open studio I have. And here they are, the finished pieces. The feldspathic crackle glaze has sort of softened the forms in some cases. It's also broken away from the rim, revealing the lovely iron-rich clay beneath, which is turned almost metallic and iridescent in some cases. Some of the shapes definitely worked more than others, but even with these differences, when displayed together or in a row, they do work, and with this initial batch tried and tested, I think the next lot will be far better. You can stick around to see some proper photographs I took of these. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.